Thank you for tuning in to another episode of my Veterans to Success podcast. You probably know by now, my mission is to help 1 million veterans and entrepreneur business owners achieve the dreams, goals, and aspirations they deserve. That is why I created the Veterans to Success podcast, because I get to interview guys, men and women, who want to share their fascinating stories with you about their time before, during and after their time in the military, so you can benefit and overcome your challenges. So sit back, relax, and get ready to be mesmerized, astounded, and entertained. Oh, and today I've got no other than Bill Kirst with me today. Hello, Bill. How are you?
Good morning, Joe. Good afternoon, where you're at. Great to see you. Good to be here.
That's fantastic. And yes, we are in different time zones because people can probably tell from your accent you're over the pond. So, as I say, no names, no pat drill. We just dive straight in. We've had a good chat. We've got to know each other, and you do have an amazing story.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do is just let's jump in from a very early age, please, on what your time was about, what was happening to you before the military.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see behind me, there's a poster here in my office we were chatting about before, and it's a very famous poster that some people may know about. It's actually the poster or sign from what's called Checkpoint Charlie. So Checkpoint Charlie, for those that don't know the history, was the dividing line between East Berlin and West Berlin during the Cold War. And so when I think about kind of my earliest beginnings before the military, I come from a military family. Both my parents were naval officers. Before that, going all the way back to World War II, there were naval officers and Army, Air Corps, people like that. But when I think about my upbringing, I had a really unique opportunity to travel around the world. And part of the reason I have this poster in my office is because when I was a teenager, I moved to Eastern Europe. We moved to Warsaw, Poland the day after communism fell. And so my upbringing and my informing and pretty formative years of my life were behind the Iron Curtain. And so I got to see democracy in its infancy in many places. I got to see what it means to be part of an institution or an organization that literally protects the rights and the lives of people around the world. And so I think early on, I saw what it meant to be part of a democracy and to be part of the defenders of democracy, not only in my lineage, but also in what I was able to view firsthand as a child growing up. And then what was interesting is I spent those formative years mostly in Eastern Europe. There was some time in Western Europe as well. But then I came back to the United States, and most people can hear from my accent. I am a U.S. citizen American, but I wasn't really educated in the U.S. system. And so we joked about this before, Joe, but I grew up reading history books and textbooks that were British.
Yeah.
And my education system was mostly British and French influence. And so when I came back to the United States for university, I went through a huge culture shock, like could not relate to my peers at all. And most of my humor was British humor. Most of my understanding was very quip British Irish humor. Many of the jokes didn't work with my peers. I didn't understand what they found so entertaining or enlightening, and vice versa. And then I graduated college and started my first job and thought I was well on my way. I was working in the travel industry at the time, and then September 11th happened, and it changed everyone's life, including mine. And from that point, I thought to myself, interestingly, prior to then, I had never really felt what it meant to be patriotic, to be really deeply kind of American and patriotic.
Right.
Because yes, I carried a passport that was US, but I related much more to Europeans and global citizens until that moment, until that event took place. And shortly after that, I went to enlist in the military. And there's quite an adventure from that point on. But let me pause there and see if that's a good enough beginning.
Yeah, it is actually, and thank you. What I remember as well when we had a chat you were born in Iran as
I
well.
was, yes.
So you spent a lot of time in Europe and
And
Berlin.
Middle East, yeah.
Yeah. You were born in Iran, and something that you said to me made me think, because what was the comments the doctor's comments when you were born?
Yes. So I was born, as I mentioned, as an American. Both my parents are American. But when I was born in 1978 in Tehran, Iran, which people can remember what was going on in Iran at the time,
Yeah.
it was the revolution was taking place. And the doctor who helped birth me, he held me in his arms and he said to my parents, in Persian that was translated later, he has the face of an old man, as in he's already lived a couple lives. And so the nickname they gave me when I was born, obviously I'm a William the Third, if you can believe that, but
Right.
obviously I go by Bill. And the doctor and everybody there called me Agha Bill, which means in Persian sort of a Mr. or a Sir or a gentleman Bill.
Oh,
And that was precisely because they said at the time he has the face of an old man or someone who's lived a life before.
right. And that was because of just a look of wisdom or something presence rather than being wizened like a
Right.
like a 90-year-old. It was, yeah, I get you. I get what you meant.
Yeah.
So that must
I
have
mean, I
been
think
quite a profound moment for your parents then.
I think it was, I think as a result of my being born in a place like Iran, amidst so much tumult and so much change, that was probably the beginnings of my understanding of what it meant to kind of lead and live and change. I also think, to your point around the wisdom, I've oftentimes, even with friends and family, when you hold an infant in your arms and you look in their eyes, I sometimes have this heartbreak moment because you look in their eyes and you say to yourself, all the answers already reside there.
Mm,
And what's really unfortunate, I think, as we go through life is we end up going through a series of reasons to forget what we already
mm,
know.
mm.
It's a matriculation in reverse, if you will. And
Yeah.
so I think that's what the doctor saw. I think that's what some might say the mystic saw. And as a result, which has been really interesting, all my life growing up, even when I was a young, wee little lad, they used to say, "Oh, Bill's 40." They used to just joke and say, "Oh, he's basically 40." And my parents had a mug, kind of a cup that they used to have their coffee in, and on the side of it, it said, "Life begins at 40." And I used to love that mug because I used to say to myself, I can't wait till I can turn 40 because I will finally be in the body, the same body as where the mind and the
Yeah,
heart have
yeah,
been all these years. So yeah, I think old soul, maybe, wise
yeah.
old soul.
And I say to people, because I think that the way that we're conditioned in our beliefs and values are made at age 7 or before age 7. That
Yes.
when the people say, oh, so a flippant comment that was no harm intended to the infant or the young child, you stupid boy or you stupid girl, what did you do that for? You're wrong, it's your fault. Why did you do that? And all these things, because I believe that when we're born, we've got 100% potential.
Yeah.
Right. Until people start telling us that we can't do it, we're not good
Right.
enough, or whatever else they want to poison our mind with, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because they may be having a bad day.
Yes. Very true. Very
Yeah.
true.
So, yeah, I love that. That's really good. So, 9/11 happened,
Yes.
right? What was going on in your mind, in your life at that time? And I mean, I remember seeing it and I just thought, what? And I
Yeah.
couldn't believe it.
It was interesting. I believe it was a Tuesday morning, if I recall correctly. I had already gone to work, and as I mentioned, I was working in the travel industry at the time. And so, to give you an idea of what that entailed, was I was actually a proposal writer for this travel management company. For those that might know, like the American Express or the Carlson Wagonlits of the world, think of like the companies that do large travel, essentially travel arrangement for companies.
Yeah.
And I was a proposal writer for that company. And so that morning, um, I was in quite early, and I got a call from a friend of mine, actually a roommate of mine, who was on her way into work. We actually worked at the same location. And she said, I'm listening to Howard Stern at the moment, and I can't tell if what they're saying is some sort of joke or trick or if it's true. Can you go to a TV and see what you can find out? Now, keep in mind, this is kind of early days. Not many people had cell phones at the time. And so I had to put the phone down, go to a TV down the hall, and I was able to see what was the imagery we now know, which is the smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And everybody was quite confused at the time. And it was in that moment live where we saw the second plane hit, and we all gasped where I was in my workplace. And part of the reason we gasped was not only for the reason that we all gasped, we couldn't believe what we were seeing, but we also knew that we had clients and customers on those planes. And
Mm.
so we kicked into action, and we had to, a lot of people went into a state of panic. But then a lot of other people had to go and check our rosters, check our itineraries to find out what flight that was. And then we had to start calling the companies of the people who we knew that we had booked on planes that were those two planes or the one in Pennsylvania. And so the day is all a bit of a blur. I remember at one point people trying to get home, and all the trains had been canceled, all the metros and subways had been canceled. And I was one of those people who took that transportation into work typically. And so I didn't have a way to get home. And I ended up going home with some coworkers, and we stopped along the way to buy me some pajamas or something because we didn't know how long we'd be home for. And it was shortly after that, I want to say maybe 4 or 5 days later, when I drove down to Washington, D.C., where I had family living. I remember at one point we were all trying to call each other that day. And as I mentioned, the cell phones were not all that prevalent then,
Mm.
and the circuits were overloaded. Ironically, I was able to stay in touch with people more using AOL Instant Messenger, which now seems like a very ancient
Yeah, yeah.
technology by comparison to what people use today. And I drove down from Philadelphia, where I was living at the time, to Washington, D.C. And the entire way on 95, which is a major highway on the eastern seaboard, was pretty much empty. And one of the layering things I remember was just the sight of an airplane in the sky, just the sound of an airplane in the sky almost put you in paralysis.
Yeah.
So we were driving into Washington, and I remember having kind of a panic attack. Like, what is that plane in the sky? Why is it there? There should be no, the airspace was closed for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And once I saw my family, I knew at that time when I was driving through Washington, D.C., and there were armored vehicles on the roads. And it just was a very surreal, almost more like the places I had lived before in Eastern Europe, where you're used to seeing this military presence in a post-revolutionary world. I thought to myself, I have to do something. I have to, I need to be a part of something bigger. I can't just do what I was doing. And so shortly after that, I went into a recruiting office and started a conversation with a recruiter about enlisting in the military.
And what year was this? How shortly afterwards?
It was the same year. So it was in the, let's see, September, so probably late September, early October
All right.
of
Okay. So it's
2001 that
pretty
I went
quick
to
then.
go talk to them. Yeah. And it was an interesting experience because at the time there were a lot of people that were trying to figure out how do I do something. We watched as the firefighters, we watched as the first responders and rescuers.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, this is all before a lot of the campaign that happened with Iraq and Afghanistan, right? That all came afterwards, and sometimes we blur all that in our recollection in our history. But I went in, and you fill out your information. They take down your name, they take down a little bit of your background, and I want to say it was maybe 2 days later, I was back at work in Philadelphia, and I got a call from a captain in the Army, and he said, is William Kirst there? I said, this is he. He said, this is Captain John Kitka. I'm holding your paperwork based on your, desire to enlist. And I just have a couple follow-up questions for you. And I said, certainly. He said, okay, I read here that you went to Johns Hopkins University. Is that true? I said, yes, sir, it is. I read here that you speak 6 languages. Is that true? Yes, sir, it is. Okay, well, young man, uh, you're not going to enlist in the military. And I said, I'm not. He said, no, you're not going to Afghanistan. I said, I'm not. He said, no, with a mind like yours, we're sending you to graduate school. And if you apply to any of these schools and get in on your own merit, it's a free ride. And I said, what? And we proceeded to have a conversation. I said, well, no, sir, I want to go in, I want to do my service, and then I'll take the GI Bill, right? And I'll go to grad school later. And he said, no, with a background like yours, a global background like yours, and your mind, we cannot afford to not have you be an officer and be shaping, future troops in our military. So began the conversation, and I applied to many schools in the Washington, D.C. area. I ended up getting into Georgetown University, and I did a 2-year accelerated program and became an officer in 2004.
Congratulations. So that was completely out of the blue, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting when I think back to it is a lot of my friends, and I think you can understand this too, a lot of my friends from college, university were quite shocked that I went into the military. And many of them reached out to me and said, "Are you sure you're doing the right thing?" Or many of them would stop and ask me, tell me why, or give me a reason why you want to do this. And the only reason I knew it was the right thing to do, Joe, is I had no words. I
Mhm.
I couldn't find the words, and that's how I knew it was true to me. Back to our point earlier, right? We go through life and having people tell us what's right, what's wrong, or sometimes they talk us out of things. And there's occasionally times when and you
Yeah, yeah.
can't put words to it. And that was one of those times for me. And it changed the trajectory of my life.
Fabulous. So this was around about 2003, 4 then. And
Mhm.
so you've just graduated on an accelerated program at uni,
Yep.
Georgetown. And then what happens to you?
Yeah, well, I expected to go full-time active duty at the time, right? Because I had done all this training, accelerated program, and I was ready to go. I was ready to be a second lieutenant. Give me my first platoon. Let's do this. And what was interesting, Joe, at the time was there were so many people that actually joined the military at that time in that window after September 11th
Yeah,
that they actually had almost a force too big to train. And what I mean by that is there were many of us who went through what we call Reserve Officer Training Corps. That's the officer training that's associated with universities and colleges.
yeah.
And 1/3 of my class was made reserve officers overnight. And what I mean by that was prior to that Monday when I showed up, I was expecting to be full-time active duty military officer. That would have been my full-time job. I showed up on that Monday, and my commander said, they've changed all your contracts because they don't have enough instructors in the schoolhouse, is what they call it, to train you. And that's because all the instructors were
Yeah.
captains and majors, and they were already in Afghanistan. So
Mm.
they didn't have enough people to train the new lieutenants that were coming into. So they took 1/3 of my class and overnight made us reserve officers. Now, what that meant was one, I had to go find a job as a civilian, right? Monday through Friday job. And two, I was going to be doing uh, training and skilling as a reserve officer on the weekends, as well as throughout what we call annual training exercises throughout the summer. And so I had to stop and understand, well, now I have to go look for a job. What was fascinating was just down the hall from where my officer, battalion was where my graduate program was, literally down the hall at
Right.
Georgetown. And so these are early days of the internet again. There we had things called bulletin boards, kind of like, persistent chat rooms today. And I was reading one of the bulletin boards online, and there was a gentleman who I went to school with. He had posted a very simple post that said, "Does anyone have a top secret clearance and they're looking for work?" And that was essentially it. I opened it up, I saw, and I responded to him and I said, "I do." And ironically, I am looking for work now, even though I thought I was going to go be a full-time Army officer. So I responded to him. He said, great, meet me in this room, 2 days later. I meet him in a room 2 days later, and it was kind of like the movies. There's two chairs in a room, nothing else. And in walks a person. They proceed to interview me. They leave. Another person walks in. They interview me. Third person walks in, says, great, we love your background. You got the job. Show up at the State Department on next Monday. And I wasn't even sure who I was being interviewed by, right? Turns out it was actually a company, a contracting company that was supporting the State Department. And I then went to go work at the State Department for a couple of years, supporting, ironically, the Iraq Policy and Operations Group. So while I didn't get to go to Iraq in the military capacity, I ended up supporting the State Department's mission for the Iraq policy and operations on the ground there, including the standing up of the embassy in Baghdad at the time. So it ended up being a bit of both worlds colliding.
And that would have been a critical time because Iraq
It was.
picked off, and
Yeah.
that was in full flow then. Yeah.
2004 to 2006. Yes, full
Yeah.
flow. Really fascinating time. I mean, obviously all the stuff that I had done at the time was all, classified, much of it now unclassified, but it was interagency work. It was me bringing together, people and programs and policy to shape how we were going to do post-construction or reconstruction, post-war diplomacy and engagement. And we had an amazing opportunity to bring in actual people with competencies and capabilities to help rebuild parts of Iraq. I had some amazing opportunities where I got to brief the secretaries of state, multiple secretaries of state, around things like the elections in Iraq. And those were some amazing times. And I think to myself, I was in my, mid to late 20s at the time, doing this work, and really to the point we made before, seeing democracy, fledgling democracies, come to life with all of their challenges and their opportunities.
Yeah, because they dropped the ball with hearts and minds, right? Especially the first time around. The second time around, they discovered a little bit more, and it's a real psychological game, because that's the equivalent of saying, "You stupid boy" or "You stupid girl, you can't do that." And then all that does is get people's backs up, and and even though the people are crying out for help, you don't give it because you're coming across as being too authoritative, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. It was, I mean, we have the advantage of hindsight now, but at the time, absolutely. I mean, there were so many British brothers and sisters that were there with us too, right? And I mean, looking back on it now, there's so many things that we can look back and see where things were ill-advised, where things were not true, where things were lacked integrity. And it's very tough for a lot of veterans, especially folks who were there and then came back, or folks that were there and lost friends, to look back at these chapters of history and understand that much of it was a crusade of sorts, and for what?
Yeah. It's the same, like we had an influx into the military of the Falklands, so similar, except that was a much shorter conflict, because there weren't insurgents. You could see the enemy, so it was easier to engage. So we could come to a resolution quite quickly, and we put in the crack forces. And after that, we had a large intake, and I witnessed this because I joined in 1981.
Yes.
And you would have seen, having been in Berlin, back in 1981, the Cold War was full on with the Russians, and none of the British Army on the Rhine were taken to the Falklands. It was all UK forces,
right?
Because as I've said before, when I've been speaking to other guys, I volunteered and to go, but because I was in Germany, they didn't take any forces from there, and thankfully I didn't either,
right?
Because it wasn't a good battle, if you like. Well, no battles are good, and since that time there have been more lives lost through suicide, drug and alcohol abuse than there were during the conflict.
Right.
And we only have to look at the history books to see that that sort of behavior goes on from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I often say to people, look, there's no winners in war, really.
Hmm.
And it's when various people in authority push you around like horns.
Like
Uh,
chess pieces.
yeah. I don't suppose we're going to solve it during this conversation, but I mean,
We probably won't, but I also think it's worth, it's worth kind of noting, like, look where we're at today in the world, right? I mean, I think what's, just the other day I was reading about um, the event in Moscow.
hey, do you enjoy sipping a good glass of wine? As you know, sipping too much wine can leave you feeling groggy in the mornings. For less than the price of a good bottle of wine, you can gain access to valuable business and life resources gained from my over 37 years in business and 15 years in the military. These world-class resources are designed to help you achieve the goals, dreams, and aspirations you deserve. So visit joelteams.com now to find out more. That's JOETEAMS.com to find out more.
Right? And having lived in Moscow for 4 years when I was in high school, and having watched essentially what was the breeding ground for what we now see, under the totalitarian, if you want to call that, under Vladimir Putin, watching what happened in Moscow and then hearing some of the words out of, Vladimir Putin, saying things like, well, these four people that were caught were they had an open corridor to escape to Ukraine. I mean, it's just preposterous, right? Because there's a history of the Russian authorities blaming other people for things, and it's part of that narrative, to the point around what is the narrative, what is the wag the dog, if you will, narrative that is taking place. And then, we hear about the missile strikes this week on Kyiv and Lviv. One of those missiles that hit Lviv on the western part of Ukraine was in Polish airspace for 2 minutes, right? So it creeped into Polish airspace to then come back in to hit Lviv, the western part of Ukraine. And, all of these news events, to me, are more throwbacks to what we knew was the Cold War, right? The behaviors that we're seeing. And I think it's essential that we all look at this, especially as veterans, with a critical eye and understanding, there are many times that we can draw a line and say, this is good and this is evil. And I think we're seeing it played out very clearly. And it's important that we as veterans stand up for what we know is right, based on what we've seen, what we've lived, but more importantly, why we joined.
Yeah. And 2 minutes in Polish airspace is an obvious violation.
Yeah.
And they'll just brush it off by saying, oh, we didn't mean to, or whatever. And yet the consequences should be greater than what will happen and what is presently happening. Because, like I say to people now, I'm not too sure how possible it would be, but if I saw a Russian soldier who was my generation of soldiers, I'd just say, what was all that about?
Right.
Let's just have a drink. I mean,
that's right.
I didn't know you then. I don't know you now. Let's have a drink and see whether
and get to know one another.
We've got any sort of common ground, because we're all humans, right? That's the one thing we got in common.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what's really fascinating is, over time, we sometimes forget that humanity, because we let all these other things get in our way. But the people that I find sometimes are the most powerful teachers when it comes back to this humanity is actually the cosmonauts and the astronauts, right? Those that go to space and see how we are one big blue marble, right? And all of a sudden borders disappear and differences disappear. And when you come back from that experience, as I understand it, having talked to astronauts, you can't help but feel the humanity and everything after that. And I wish we did more of that. I wish we could send politicians to space and say, go do that, come back.
Leave them there.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because that certainly is taking a global view, isn't it? Uh,
Right. How do you come back and presume to make the same statements once you've seen how insignificant you are as an individual, but more importantly, how collective we are all one. And this is it, right? So that to me has been fascinating learning from the cosmonauts and the astronauts. To your point, they come down, they say, let's go have a drink. Like,
mm,
let's put all this other stuff aside. What was it all about? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you've done some interesting stuff with the State Department as
Hmm.
the Iraqi advisor, I suppose. Then what happens? Then where do you go next? What's on the agenda
Yeah.
for you?
Yeah, well, what's kind of interesting at this point, Joe, and for those that have worked in sort of the interagency space, even in, international interagency space, the tough part is most of what you do, you can't talk about, right? So I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I'd work all day, and then we'd go to these, I mean, for lack of a better term, these happy hours. Nobody could really talk about what you did. So we'd all talk about like the weather and sort of silly things like that. And I was 2.5 years into that, and I realized there was nothing I could put on my resume, and there was nothing I could talk about, which most of the time is fine. But I actually had a friend of the family who I used to babysit their children. She came to me and she said, "Hey, what are you doing right now?" And of course, I talked very generically. Oh, I'm working at a consulting company doing. And she said, "I want you to work for me." Well, she worked at IBM, one of the largest companies
Yeah,
at the
yeah, yeah.
time. And I thought to myself, well, what do I know about IBM? But ironically, IBM was doing a very similar type of approach just with civilian agencies, right? So not necessarily with the military at the time, but with civilian agencies. So I was hired at IBM to essentially do an interagency stand up between the Department of Justice, FBI, Asset Forfeiture Program, Drug Enforcement Administration, so forth and so on. And it was tied to their mission and their work, but ironically, it all had to do with technology. So, what is the technology we're going to give to these agencies to help them be more transparent, serve their citizens better, report to Congress, as you can imagine. So I became this sort of communication transformation manager at IBM and worked with all of these civilian agencies in the US government. And I did that for close to 8 years, working across the US government and all different agencies, including departments like the US Department of Veterans Affairs, which was great work that I did there as a reserve officer to get to be in both spaces. What was interesting at the time, and I'll share this story with you because I think you'd appreciate it. Sometimes working with those government entities was challenging because in their eyes, I was a business person, right? I was an IBM corporate spy, some of them used to call me. And you'd have to earn their trust, as we talked about before, building relationships and trust. And when they would learn that I was a military officer in the reserves, as I was a captain by then, it all changed. Like all these people that were at the FBI or Drug Enforcement Administration or Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, all these people initially would say, "I don't trust you because you're a business entity." But then they would learn that on my weekends and in my summers, I was wearing a uniform as a military officer. Well, many of them were also in the military, right? And the
Yeah.
trust was instant. And so what ended up happening was I built this very powerful career working in that space as both a civilian and as a reserve officer. And a couple of times I even had clients that were in the Pentagon at that time, one of which was the US Air Force. And I used to have these amazing clients say to me, "Hey, Bill, I need you to put your captain hat on for a moment." And then they knew they couldn't really do that, right? Because I was being paid as a private citizen working for IBM. But what that meant to me was, hey, let's go take a walk, Bill. Let's go grab a cup of coffee. And I just need to like get some advice, captain to captain, right? So I would almost take off my IBM hat, put on my captain hat. We'd have a conversation, and it would mostly be about life and how to influence, right?
Yeah.
And how to solve problems. And I really grew to be proud of that because what it meant was they trusted me and I trusted them. And it was an incredible, incredible career that I had at IBM for 8 years.
And that's remarkable, really, when you think that, because like when you were a young child, you probably felt challenged, and like you've moved from Iran, then to Europe. you've not
Mhm.
really known your place. You've watched the Berlin Wall be torn down. You're in there. You're watching communism change to
Mhm.
slightly diplomacy, although that can be a tongue-in-cheek phrase. And then you go to America, and you told me that you felt isolated
Yeah.
previously, because and I get it, because I know when I've spent time in America, what I think funny, some Americans look at me and think, huh?
Right.
And I think they're getting better now, I'll be honest. But yeah, because you've had things like The Office over there
Right.
and
Yep.
Monty
Which is all built
Python.
on British humor. Like
Yeah,
we get
yeah,
our
yeah,
humor from you all. So
yeah. So, and then all of a sudden, right, what was probably seen as a disadvantage, to put it
Mhm.
mildly, and at a young age, now becomes something that you can really use to your advantage, and it's a strength, isn't it? Because
It became a superpower. That's exactly right, Joe. I mean, if I think back to what people asked me to take on in my civilian career, they gave me really challenging um, problems to solve. And they gave me problems to solve between people who, in many cases, were speaking the same language, but were not saying the same thing, if that makes
yeah,
sense. So,
yeah,
so I would have these these parts of the government where people were saying exactly the same words across tables, but every single person had a different understanding of those words and what it meant in a mission sense, in a budget sense, in a resource sense. And I ended up being this interpreter in
mm,
many cases,
yeah,
which throws back to my early days of learning all these languages in countries and being the family interpreter. Many times I would have to go shopping with my mom because she needed me to be the Polish speaker and make sure we were getting the right stuff. Same thing when I was in Russia, learned Russian to fluency. I was able to be the family interpreter there. And I think you're right. Many of those skill sets that were not necessarily maximized at the time, or maybe people felt like, well, is that really going to come to fruition? It did. I just think it came to fruition in an unexpected way, but for a much bigger benefit as I think about, giving back to the citizen experience and helping shape policy, helping people inform what decisions are made that impact millions of people around this country and around the world.
yeah. And it's the everyday decision where
Mhm.
you recognize that something from the past, you say, hey, I can use this. And you're dead right. I mean, where I use it, because when I go into businesses to help bring it together as a team, whether that be financial structures or looking at people structures, sometimes what amuses me is they may well be singing from the same hymn book.
Yeah,
Some of them aren't on the same page, and in fact, some of them aren't even singing the same verse.
that's right.
So I mean, then it all falls down, and yeah, and it's about bringing it together so they can be. And when you were talking before about uh, Iraq too, when there was
Hmm.
still some mistakes made. I think that what I like about military culture is, unlike politicians, when they come up with the normal phrase, or they do in the UK anyway, lessons will be learned, and you think, yeah, really.
Mm,
In the military, we do tend to do that because um, if we don't, the loss of life is the
that's right.
result. Not a few £1 million or dollars lost.
Right.
It's the loss of the most precious thing that we've got.
Yes, absolutely. And I think to me, when I think back to even now being a veteran, right, I still think so much about the Army values. When people ask me, like, what informs your style of leadership? A lot of what informs my style of leadership are the Army values, right? There's because even though I'm not under the tent of the Army anymore, I have to be able to put my head on the pillow every night and fall asleep without any hesitation, without any regret. And those are the things that I pull forth, when I think about how I inform decisions, because we were the caretakers of lives. We were the protectors of lives. And I don't take that lightly at all. Even if I'm not wearing the uniform, I still feel like we are kind of bringing to life all the values that we stood by and signed up for.
Thank you. for that. And round about just before your time with IBM came to a natural end, you left the military just
I did.
before that, didn't you? So
I
what
did.
was that? Right. And on a CV, you just see dates before, start date, end date,
Yeah.
and you don't see all the stuff going on behind it. So I would imagine, and I'm not sure, and
Mm.
I don't read palms, I don't tell the fortune of the future, but I would imagine there was a bit of stuff going on in your life around that time.
Yeah, you're right. You know, I think there's a couple of things that came to play. I'd probably say the number one thing was at the time that I was in the military, there was actually a policy in place that some may remember called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell."
Yeah.
And that policy was put in place under Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton at the time. And what it said was those that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, uh, this is before even transgender was part of that discussion, but essentially LGBT, um, don't we won't ask you about it. You don't tell us about it, right? You just kind of live your life. And you know, on the surface, everybody's like, okay, that seems like a fair approach, but the hard part for me at the time was one of the values of the Army values is integrity. And
Mm,
integrity is probably the most important value to me in life. And what I found really interesting was as I went through, you know, the military, I had to live this double life. Now, I was very successful at living this double life. I was very successful in my career path in both civilian and in the Army, but I was constantly looking over my shoulder, right, to make
mm,
sure that if I was someplace where somebody might see me, or I was talking to someone where somebody might, you know, put two and two together, and that became exhausting. It also became something that was unexpectedly made me really good at my job. And what I mean by that, Joe, is I became extremely good at living a compartmentalized life.
mm.
And it's probably the one of my strongest gifts that I'm least proud of
Yeah.
because I had to. It was survival. And I was a general's aide to three different generals at the time. I was extremely successful at that role. And part of the reason I was so good at my job was because I was constantly in fear that somebody would come and say, I learned that he's a gay man or a gay soldier and he should be thrown out. I needed to make sure that my work was so stellar, so pristine, so valuable that no officer above me would say, okay, given this knowledge, I think you should be thrown out. Now, I was very fortunate during my time. I never had any of those instances come up. And when the policy of don't ask, don't tell fell in, I want to say like 2011, somewhere between 2010, 2011, uh, I started to realize that, okay, now I can show up as myself in the military unit, but do I want to? Right? They already
Mm,
know me as you know, Captain Kirst at this point. I don't wear it on my sleeve. What people do in home and who they love is their business, nobody else's. It never had anything to do with the mission for me. And so I started to realize that I watched the Army and all the policies change around me, I think for the better. However, I also started to see where there were people that were not willing to change. And the
mm,
politics, and you know this, many people know this, as you move up the ranks, and I was about to go to major, the politics got more intense and people started, you know, asking, you know, you to behave differently or make decisions that I never would have made for my own integrity. And a fork in the road started for me. And I had to ask myself again, always, am I willing to put my head on the pillow at the end of the day with no regrets and proud of what I did today? And there was a time where I said, let me step away from the military because I don't see what they're doing. I don't like some of the decisions they're making, and
mm,
it's in conflict with my own integrity. Let me step away for a year. And at the time, I could do something called the Individual Ready Reserve. It's a program where basically in the United States, you can kind of be in almost like tucked away, ironically tucked away in the closet, if you want to call it that, to be like, hey, if we need you, we'll come get you, but otherwise you just live your life. And I made myself a promise, and that was during that year, if I thought about the military once, if I missed it once, if I thought, hey, the nostalgia's there, then I would go back in. But if I didn't think about it once, if I didn't miss it once, and I felt like I had a new freedom to pursue the things I wanted in life, then I would not rejoin. And I was surprised by the fact that I went a whole year and never thought about it once. And by
Right.
then my civilian career was quite exponential, right? You find yourself
Yeah.
doing quite well on the civilian career. And I realized that the gap between my civilian life and my skills and my passions and where I would have been on the track of my military, that gap was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I had to make a decision. And I'm glad I made the decision I made, which was, can I do more good as a veteran, helping the institution from the outside in, than I could to get the institution to change from the inside out?
Yeah.
And that's when I made that decision.
Thank you, Bill. Because look, knowing your career path in the military, you were going to be promoted to major, so you were doing pretty okay
Yeah.
in because that was in the space of 8 years. So on
Mm-hmm.
a non-commissioned officer basis, you're pretty much for staff sergeant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which
Mm-hmm.
is flying in 8 years.
It's going fast. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And when you started to recognize that society was more accepting
Yeah.
the LGBT movement.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find that? Did you just say, yeah, wear your heart, I can wear my heart on my sleeve and that's okay? Or was there still some caution in the way you communicated
Yeah.
yourself, really?
Yeah. I think there will always be caution. I think for me, it is fascinating to watch how much has changed over the course of the 20, 25 years of the arc of this. However, I think maybe because of where I grew up, maybe because of my upbringing, right? You and I both kind of share that from the standpoint of our early Catholicism and some of those values that inform. I've had to walk this path so many times where I have to say to myself, how do I remain about integrity and how do I stay a member of said institution or part of society? And at the end of the day, I end up probably staying more cautious. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to be a one-man rebellion. And I personally believe that change happens one conversation at a time.
Yeah,
I'm not going to be the one to wave a banner or to disrupt a meeting or to declare something. Instead, what I want is people to get to know me for who I am, admire who I am and who I go through this life, and then understand what makes you who you are and who, frankly, who loves you, like who makes you an even better human because of who's in your life. And so for me, I knew that society was going to slowly change, and that's fine. And I think like most things, the pendulum swings both ways, right? We go to one extreme to the other, and we're seeing all that play out now. But I also feel the part I can play now is more with organizations like the Minority Veterans of America, which is the veterans experience itself is a minority. And then
mm,
you put on top of that LGBT,
yeah,
and then you put on top of that the mental health, and then you put on top of that maybe their skin color or their ethnicity. And so you could see how it compounds and compounds and compounds. And then eventually you feel very alone in the world.
yeah,
And I chose to spend my time making those people feel less alone in the world, to your point, so that they can live a full life. And that's probably a little bit different than what some might choose, right? The path to make change happen. I I've always been the type to say we change by healing. We only heal by telling stories to each other,
yeah,
right? Similar to what you said, can you sit down and have a beer with someone, right?
yeah.
It's like cozied up to the edge of a pub, bar, and you can truly solve some problems. I think that's where I chose to spend some of my time, as opposed to saying, let me, you know, let me put myself on a poster or be an activist. Now, in many ways, I choose to be an activist, but it might be a little bit more of a understated, quiet, human to human activist.
And because I remember, because when we've chatted before, I've shared with you openly that when the subject of uh, gays and lesbians were in the army, the only way I was looking at it, and there were a lot of bigots. There was, there were some extreme situations. I just looked at it purely operationally,
Yeah.
because if you have two guys or two women in a section and you've got an 8-man section and one of them gets injured or down, then you've lost 25% of your section. Obviously, the rest of the section would be sad, but if they're in a relationship, that's even going to be worse.
Right.
So that would only be my consideration. Otherwise, I just think that if the guy, man or woman, can do the job, I don't care.
Right.
I want someone who can watch my back, do the job, and just get it done when it's supposed to be
Yes.
done. And if that happens, I'm all right. The only ism, like you've got racism, ageism, all the rest of the isms, the only ism I've got is lazyism.
Yes.
I don't like lazyism because that doesn't serve any purpose. Any other
Right.
ism, you can just get rid of it. You could just, you can just get shot.
Yeah.
So that's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that, and I'm so pleased you've been willing to be so open, because I'm sure that will help a tremendous amount of people. And the fact that what you're on your campaign to achieve. So you left IBM, and then you pretty much headhunted then, and you go on a search, because then you go to different places where you only short stays. What happened there then?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, after IBM, I ended up being recruited by one of my customers at IBM, which was the University of Washington. I worked at the university for about 10 months. One of the things I learned at the time was universities are places where I'm naturally attracted to universities, right? If anywhere in the world, I like to be near a campus, near a university. And I think it's obvious why. We love the energy, the learning, the youth, the academic, the library. It's a very fervent energy. And I thought to myself, well, I could work there and it would be the best of both worlds. I learned very quickly that universities are like trying to turn an aircraft carrier when it comes to change, right? It takes a long time to change a university and to turn that aircraft carrier. And ultimately what was really interesting was I was brought in by a president of the university who was very business focused. He had an agenda where he wanted to bring in a lot of business leaders like myself to help them turn that ship. He then got recruited by another university and left. And everybody that was brought in under him, basically, when the provost came in, was like, bye-bye. Everybody that was brought in by him, because he left, off we went. I went back into consulting for a while, for about 6 years. During that time, I started something on my own as a passion project, started a podcast very similar to you. And that podcast was heard by Microsoft in 2021. And Microsoft reached out to me and said, hey, we've heard your podcast. You do a really impressive blend of storytelling, guiding people through change, capturing what kind of the lessons that people need as humans to really go through change successfully. Could you come do that for us at Microsoft? And of course I said yes. And I was there for about a year and a half.
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, right. Like who turns them down? And I had an amazing time there. I was a director of change for their commercial systems and business intelligence. Long title basically means any change that came internal to Microsoft, be it with process, people, policy, org changes. My team and I got to lead those changes and make it less painful for people. It's essentially what you and I were talking about. Make people feel less alone and make the change feel less painful.
Yeah.
And then speaking of pain, and ironically, tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of the layoffs at Microsoft. So my team and I were completely let go on March 27th, 2023. No heads up. I got a call on a Monday morning and was told essentially, your position's been eliminated. And so that was pretty devastating at the time, unexpected and devastating. I then leaned into that grief. And one of the things I did, interestingly, Joe, was I went back into, there's a storage closet right here, and I pulled down all these old journals and these diaries that I had written in for years and years and years. And I found myself reading all these old poems that I'd written maybe from like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And before I knew it, I had been tearing these pieces of paper out of these notebooks and diaries. I looked down on my floor, and every inch of my office was covered with a piece of paper that had a poem on it. And I found myself standing literally on my own work and realizing how helpful it was for me to reread these in my moment of grief. And I said, well, if it was this helpful to me, perhaps it's helpful to others. And so I collected all those pieces of paper. I went to a local cafe. I typed until there was nothing else to type. And then I published my first book, which is a poetry
Awesome.
collection. And
And
that was where I put all the grief.
and what's that called again?
So the title is called Everword. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a play on words, and it's a poetry collection. And I self-published in August. August 8th was when it came out. And the following week, I got a job at Adobe. And so now I'm leading change for Adobe, the very well-known brand that's all about creativity
I was just
for
about to
everyone.
say, which is another small company.
Yeah, another small company.
And how
And
can
that's where I'm at.
people get their hands on that book?
Yeah,
No.
so you can order it through Amazon primarily. I did self-publishing, so I did it through Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing. But if you
Yeah.
just search for Everword, Everward, or WG Kirst, so everybody's like, what's WG stand for? Well, remember I mentioned I'm a William III, so
Yeah.
William Gregory Kirst. And so yeah, you can order on Amazon. It's also on Kindle. Some people have asked that I do an Audible version of it
Yeah,
so that
that'd be a
we
good idea. Yeah, yeah.
um, but I've noticed, interestingly enough, veterans have really responded to it, and I think it's because there are many things that we as veterans don't get to say to the world. We
Mm,
rarely say, to each other, but poetry plays a really big, powerful role for a
yeah,
lot of veterans, and I think it's because you can say things in a certain way that in some cases it's veiled, and in
yeah.
other cases, it's very direct. And that balance of the two is a place where a lot of veterans can place their emotions because there's not a lot of places we can place our emotions
Yeah,
safely.
and as you read in the poetry, you can make up your own story from it as well.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it can be a real emotional roller coaster, which allows cathartic is a word that comes.
Yeah, catharsis. It's a great word.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which I think because I know with the Pathfinder I've published, I did something, and when I read it, it still almost brings a tear to my eye because when I was lying paralyzed in the bed,
Hmm.
this thing keeps going through my mind, the man who thinks he can. And then I wrote a verse, quite a long verse, about how I felt at that time, the alpha male,
Yeah.
injured selection, SAS. All I wanted to do was pass. And then what I've done since is I've written another verse a decade later. Right.
Hmm.
So we're 25 years in since my incident. So I've got three verses all spanning those
Yes.
years.
Those
And
decades.
and the change is magnificent because
Hmm.
the first one was about alpha male, all about how the men can do it, me, I suppose. Then it's
Yeah.
about how to share your life with another person. And then it's
Hmm.
about together,
Yep.
togetherness. So it
Chapters.
shows a different swing.
Yeah, and that's what to me, I love that you shared that because that's essentially what happened to me when I sort of unpacked
Mm,
almost 3 decades of writing and
yeah,
realized, wow, I didn't realize that thing that I wrote in 2002 would be so powerful in 2023 and vice versa. And so it really is a chapter of life that's captured. And to me, I mean, one of the greatest things I had a veteran meet me in person. He came to Seattle. He had a copy of my book. We sat down. He said, "Will you sign it?" And we had conversations from a place that he had never really been able to delve before. And,
yeah,
if you'd said to me, a year ago, hey, you're going to go through a layoff, you're going to write your first book, that first book is going to help veterans all over the world and people reach out because your words gave them voice, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we
yeah.
are today.
Well, at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'll raise a glass for you. It may be a glass of water because it's daytime, but I'll say Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. That is a beautiful way to say it. Thank you,
Tom-
Joe.
Tomorrow, Happy New Year. So have a great
Yeah.
New Year's Eve tonight.
Yeah. I didn't think
Because,
of it that way, but yeah.
yeah, because if it, what is it? The phrase I love, shit happens. Do you like coffee? A lot of people tend to spend money on expensive coffees from outlets without even thinking about it. Well, for the price of just 2 coffees per month, you can gain access to valuable business and life resources gained from my over 37 years in business and 15 years in the military. These world-class resources are designed to help you achieve the goals, dreams, and aspirations you deserve. So visit joeteams.com now to find out more. That's JOETEAMS.com to find out more.
Yep.
Right. And if it doesn't kill you, it'll do you good. And now
Yes.
you're working for one of the other most recognizable companies in the world,
Yeah,
and you're affecting change.
that's right. That's
So
why I get up every day.
how cool is that?
It is, and it never would have happened, but for, right? So I feel extremely blessed and grateful, and creativity obviously plays a huge part of my life. And now I get to shape that, be a part of it, literally be a part of putting tools for creativity into the hands of people all over the world. Like that fills your cup in a different way. And I think about all the veterans. I think about folks like you who have stories where it's like I started my own business, right? I took on my own journey, and I think about the power of them using tools that take their ideas and their visions and their dreams and make them into real things.
Yeah,
I love that aspect of truly the democratization of digital creation of our world today, right? Everything from podcasts like this to people doing their own campaigning to starting a business to, you know, helping a community achieve things. All of those are done with the power of visual and voice and imagery. And I love that I get to be here.
that's fabulous. And I would I would imagine that your life is littered, that's not the greatest term, with coaches and mentors.
Hmm.
So when I say littered, I mean I'm coming from a place of
Yeah.
genuine love. Right.
Yeah.
So how important do you think that having a good coach or mentor is?
It's critical. I will say that, we used to have this poster when I was growing up, right? Because my mom was also a nurse, and it had the picture of the quintessential doctor, the surgeon Norman Rockwell. But and he used to say, behind every great doctor is an incredible nurse, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I think very much about the dynamic that exists between people who get to lead, right? So I get to lead a lot of people, you get to lead a lot of people, but in our margins of life are these incredible people that inspire us and motivate us and coach us. So I was very fortunate. One of the best things that came out of my time at IBM is a gentleman who is very much my mentor and has been. He's been at IBM for 35 years.
wow.
And I've learned so much from him. And ironically, I would not have met him but for the fact that when I came out after the Don't Ask, Don't Tell thing ended, I introduced myself on an employee resource network group, and they sent me to a conference. And that conference was sponsored by IBM, all about inclusion, diversity. I sat down at that table, and this gentleman, who's now a huge part of my life, a huge mentor and friend, basically said, "Hey, is the seat taken?" And that's how it happened. And now, like, we've known each other for 15, close to 15 years, and we talk all the time. I would not be where I'm at but for the people that are my coaches and mentors and friends, in many cases, friends. And sometimes they start off in one role and then the roles reverse a little bit. So there are times when they go through something in their life. There are many men in my life who are probably in their 50s and 60s, and they were pivotal to me in my 20s and 30s. And
Yeah.
interestingly, now they're going through their second sort of iteration of life, and they're reaching out to me to say, "Hey, I could get some advice on stuff." And that's a really humbling experience, Joe, when that happens, because you get to return the favor. I mean, they were the archetypes of success for me. They helped me get through my toughest times.
Yeah.
And now they're reaching out to me to say, hey, can you help me get through maybe not their toughest times, but pretty instructive times for
Mm,
their late 50s and 60s. Yeah.
that's fabulous. And talking of which, because you just touched on it there about social network and business network,
Hmm. Hmm.
how important is that to build and develop, and the importance of just remembering conversations? So you may
Yeah.
not recognize at the time that you are building a network, but
Yeah.
it actually is, isn't it?
Every single time. So without putting a lot of burden on people to think, oh, I have to constantly think about this, right? I do agree with you that every interaction matters because every interaction builds upon itself. And that's why I encourage everyone to really root in your integrity and your authenticity. It shouldn't take work to be the best of who you are. And if you are the best of who you are, you will be remarkable, meaning you will be remembered, and then people will reach back out to you. The world is tough enough as it is. You shouldn't have to also put on several layers of armor and masks and try and remember, well, did I say this to Joe or did I say that to Bill? Like, that's just exhausting, right? To
Yeah,
play
yeah,
that
yeah.
game of duplicitous. And sadly, I think in corporate politics, in world politics, and geopolitics, we see examples of where people tell us that's the only way to survive. And I'm a living, breathing example of the opposite. I don't play
Mm.
those games. This is one wild and precious life. Now, some people might say it's a little bit risky to be genuine and authentic, but that's, I'm willing to take that risk
Yeah,
because the reward is bigger for me.
and it's a lot risky not to be
Hmm.
genuine because
Yes,
you get found out.
absolutely. It'll all come crumbling down eventually. And honestly, it's kind of like the Berlin Wall, right? I tell people when they say, well, when I came out, I was 30 years old. I came out to my family and they said, well, why? Like, why then? And couldn't you have, in some cases people ask, couldn't you have gone on longer? And I said, it was like holding up the Berlin Wall.
Mm.
My arm got tired.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
even if I was able to hold up the Berlin Wall, the people on the other side had taller ladders. Right? They just kept building taller and taller ladders to try and see into my, like, understand me. And eventually they would have gotten over it, but I got tired of holding up the wall. And when that came down, I had to let people in. And that is a risk, but it was also rewarding.
Yeah. So you could put you are now leaving the safe sector.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
You are now leaving the preserved, safe, uh,
yeah,
masked up
yeah.
sector.
And
But yeah,
you know what? That's where the excitement happens, and that's when you go on a journey of discovery, isn't it?
yeah. I mean, that's what life's about, right? Like the only way we truly understand who we are is to let others in some cases and also go through heartbreak. Like
Mm,
sometimes we let people in and it leads to let down. And that's okay. That's heartbreak. That's literally the reminding you that you're alive.
yeah.
And I think it's worth it because it's only through human relationship and human dynamic that we can kind of advance what we're meant to be and who we're meant to be. And that's where creativity and storytelling and all that plays a role.
And I meant to ask you before, how uh, did you have any pieces of paper with the poetry on that wasn't wet from your tears?
Honestly, I think every single one of them, and even now, sometimes I go back and like it's a little still unnerving that I'm like I have a published book and I'll like flip back every once in a while and I'll read them. And what's really fascinating to me is like there's multiple dimensions to these things because even as I read them now, they mean different things to me.
Yeah.
And that's the best part about, this, the minute you write something and publish something, it's no longer yours.
Mm,
And so what I'm noticing about the poetry now is it's almost like it's done a full lap around the world and it's come back to me. And even now I'm reading it differently and it's bringing up different emotions. And God bless, right? Like that just I want that experience. I want to have multiple sensations
yeah,
when you can because that's how you know that you're still affected. You're still able to be changed.
yeah.
But yeah, pretty much every one of those things had an emotional response. And I think one of the interesting things was for me, I had to go through multiple, I don't say edits because it's poetry, so it's not like you're doing the same edit, but I chose one day where I sat on the porch, I put my phone on record, and I read every poem that's in that collection
Wow.
aloud, and I listened back to it. Now that was a very powerful catharsis.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. Yeah.
So yeah,
Hey, just imagine once you've turned this into Audible, then
I know, believe me.
in between the boo-hoo and the hisses
I,
and wiping the tears.
well, I applaud anyone that does the reading of books in Audible or any of those things because the power of the voice, as we both know, it stirs a different emotion. And there's an intimacy that you hear when you listen to things in your ears, right? It's there's a proximity and an intimacy that is experienced. So I regard the narrators, those that read books, I regard them so well, and I aspire to do that someday. But you're right, there'll have to be a lot of tissues or water or nearby and lots of breaks, I'm sure.
So, in a sentence, how do you deal with failure?
Mm, I delight in it because it tells me that there's more to learn.
Good.
And if I'm not learning, then I'm probably bored. Um, and there's such a lifelong arc to this for me.
Mm.
So for me, I mean, failure is certainly a letdown, and there's heartbreak there, but I also I see the other side of it. Like it tells me I am limited. And if I know that I am limited, then there is more for me to learn.
Yeah.
And that fills me.
And I think you'll agree when I say it's important to recognize that failure doesn't mean to say you've failed. You've
Right.
only failed when you give up.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
There's,
I've never given up on anything in my entire life. Like I've
yeah,
had a lot of people tell me this won't work for these reasons. You shouldn't do this. You should. I've had that all my life.
yeah,
And then I just laugh and I say, well, you clearly don't know me.
yeah,
And I keep going.
yeah. It's like me being in my professional career as a financial advisor for since 1988. Wow, all that time. And I've seen some booms, busts, bear markets, bull markets, crashes, you name it,
Yeah.
collisions, the lot. And when clients have phoned me, I mean, I've had some clients over 20 years, and now they just phone me as a matter of course. They say, Joe, the market's gone down. I say, yeah, that's a good observation. They say, well, what do you think? I say, well, what we talked about before. And the one thing that I always say, because I don't know what the future is going to hold. I don't know whether the
Right.
markets are going to go up or down. What I do know is you only lose when you sell.
That's right.
Because most people's psychology says when it's low, sell, when it's high, buy, which is not the way to do it. Because
Right.
buy fear, sell greed. So
Mhm.
when it's
Yeah.
fear is when it's down and everyone's getting out. That's the time
Right.
to get in. And by the way, do not take this as financial advice if you're listening. I'm just giving. Whoa, no, no, no. I'm just giving what I was told.
Right.
And sell greed. When everyone's getting in, get out. And now my clients recognize that they phone me as a matter of course rather than for advice per se,
Yeah.
because and I think that's where the pain and gain comes in, which you've been
Mhm.
talking about. So, what's the one tip that you would give to either someone who's coming out of the military, a
Mm.
guy that's been out of the military, guy being man or woman, a veteran who's already out, maybe struggling, or maybe being really successful, or a civilian who just wants some good tips? What's the one tip that you would give about life?
Yeah. Well, I think what it really comes down to is it's kind of where we started, which is I think every single one of us has a very unique flame inside of us, right? That there's that unique thing that makes you you.
Mm,
And we go through life and we're told sometimes to lessen that flame or dampen that light. And we know it's like a pilot light, it'll never go out in us. But we choose in some situations not to light it for whatever reasons. The advice I really want to give veterans, any gender, any walk of life, and in civilians in some cases, is reunite with that pilot light. Spend time getting back to that thing that uniquely makes you you, the thing you dreamed about when you were 15, right? It's there. You may not have had a conversation with it for a while, but truly, I believe that it's from that place, that reunification, that reunion, that people will find goodness and bring goodness to the world. That's my personal belief. That's the advice I would have given myself years ago. That's the advice that sort of emerged out of this poetry collection.
Yeah.
And that's the piece where I'm feeling, and there's the to be able to meet someone eye to eye and say, not only do you matter, but the thing that makes you uniquely you matters. And I'm here to help bring it to life in whatever form and function that looks like. That's the piece that I would encourage people to get in touch with, or, reach out to your best friend in life who's always seen you that way, right? Has never seen you any other way. Spend time with them and see what arises. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much for that. And
Yeah.
we're coming towards the close now, and something that always interests me when I speak to people in general, especially veterans though, is about life skills and transferability. And you know, guys who've been in the military often are terrified of leaving the institution.
Yeah.
And do not recognize the strengths that they've got from the skills that they've discovered and learned and been taught and drilled into even. So how transferable do you think they are to civilian street? And like companies like Microsoft, Adobe, in fact, companies are throughout the world, how useful do you think they would find the skills that the veterans have?
I think the usefulness is not only immediate, meaning we need those those skills immediately, but I think there's a depth and a duration to those skills. And what I mean by that is I actually believe the military is one of the remaining institutions that in many ways could be the sort of the living laboratory of understanding the human dynamic. And it's also a place where very quickly all of our differences fade away because we've been able to focus on one common mission, right? And focus on something greater than self. So that the concept of selflessness is something that I think organizations would pay top dollar for, right? To have somebody that's a hard worker and puts the organization and the mission above self always. To me, I know that can be hard to translate for veterans as they step into corporations, step into commercial entities or private life. I think the piece to remember is that you focus on the people, you focus on safety, you focus on integrity, and then you let the rest of it sort of in logistics fall to where it needs to fall to, and things will work out. I personally think that veterans, when they show up on day one at an organization, they want to bring all of their superpowers. And organizations don't necessarily know how to put those into action. But I encourage veterans to show up as their best selves. And when in doubt, ask questions, right? We came from an organization where you typically weren't allowed to ask questions, you followed orders. But in truth, to inquire and to ask questions is a wonderful thing to do. And it's the only way that, frankly, you can figure out how to best advance this organization that you're a part of. And more importantly, it's how they get to know you.
Yeah.
Because there's a piece that I think veterans have, which is critical thinking, critical systemic thinking. We think end to end. We think if I do this, then that's going to happen. If I do this, then the third order of effects is going to happen. That is worth its weight in gold. And a lot of organizations don't have that systemic critical thinking that is born and bred in veterans. So I would encourage organizations to think how they can use that. And I encourage veterans to never forego that. Do not leave that skill set at the door. Bring that, ask critical questions, be curious, understand that nobody's going to tell you what to do anymore. You can't just follow orders. You've really got to lead with that, that wondering and that curiosity, and then focus on integrity, people, and the mission.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
And what does the future hold for you now? And I'm not asking you to disclose that you're going to resign from Adobe next week.
No.
But what does the future hold for you globally, generally, taking an astronaut's view?
Yeah, an astronaut's view. If I close my eyes and I think about it, I'm writing many more books. I've probably got about 3 or 4 more novels that are in me, that are sort of emerging. I see a lot more travel in the future. We haven't done as much travel as I'd like to do. And there's a part of me that's also a lyricist and a musician, and I can eventually see myself taking a lot of my skills, my passions, my superpowers again, and going to apply them in a place of music, be it production, be it composition, picking up an instrument again. There's so much creativity that is bubbling out of me, and that's what I see in the long picture. I don't know where that's at. I don't know who that's with. I see the podcast going on still for a long, my own podcast going on for a long time still, because that brings me a lot of
and the name
joy.
of that podcast is
Coffee and Change.
Coffee and Change, and that's on the usual resources.
Yeah, it's on all the platforms, and I mean, essentially what it is it's kind of like 2 people getting together and having a really great conversation over a couple cups of tea or coffee. That's essentially what it is, and that brings me a lot of joy. It continues to be a very instructive thing for me, because it's through other people's stories what we learn about ourselves. So that's kind of my astronaut view of Bill Kirst in the next 20 to 30 years, I guess.
Smart. And how can people get in touch?
Yeah, so I'd probably say LinkedIn is best. If you look up Bill Kirst on LinkedIn, I'm pretty prolific on there. I've got newsletters that I write, lots of blogs. Follow Coffee and Change, the podcast. You'll hear my voice quite a bit. And then certainly, last but not least, if you want to order the book, feel free to do that. If you like poetry, I'd be more than honored, and stay tuned for more books and writings. And I do some stuff on Substack as well. So it's not hard to find me.
Fabulous. That's great. Bill Kirst, thank you for your service. Thank you for sharing with me and our listeners your life story.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Brilliant. And listen, right, until the next time, I'd just like to say, I look forward to speaking to you again. And until then, have a brilliant day. JoeTeams.com is a resource I've created to fulfill my mission to help 1 million veterans and business entrepreneurs like you achieve the goals, dreams, and aspirations they deserve. JoeTeams.com is jam-packed full of valuable resources specifically designed to help you on your journey to success. Visit JoeTeams.com now to find out how you can join and start your journey to success immediately. That's JoeTeams.com, JoeTeams, JoeTeams.com. And until we meet again, have a brilliant day.